Every morning at exactly 9 a.m., Kenneth Fraser would walk through the quiet suburban streets of Irvine, California, delivering mail with a friendly smile and a warm greeting. Neighbors trusted him, children waved at him. For over 2 decades, he was the face of reliability in their community. But what they didn't know was that their beloved mailman was hiding the darkest secret imaginable. He was a killer. On a cold December morning in 2022, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut would finally bring justice to a family that had waited 21 years for answers. This is the story of how Genealogy exposed a trusted community member as a cold-blooded murderer, and how DNA evidence became the silent witness that would never lie. If you're fascinated by how modern forensic science is solving decades-old mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because today's case will leave you questioning everyone you think you can trust. Let's dive into one of the most shocking betrayals of community trust in California's history. Irvine, California in 2001 was the epitome of suburban paradise. Perfectly manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and a crime rate so low that residents often left their doors unlocked. It was the kind of place where the American dream felt tangible, where families moved to escape the chaos of big city life. But on the evening of March 15, 2001, this illusion of safety would be shattered forever. 23-year-old Jessica Hamilton was everything a young woman in Irvine was supposed to be. Fresh out of UC Irvine with a degree in communications, she had landed her dream job at a local marketing firm and was planning her future with her college sweetheart, Michael Torres. Jessica lived alone in a modest apartment complex on Baywood Drive, just 3 miles from where she grew up. Her parents, David and Linda Hamilton, had raised her to be independent but cautious, smart but trusting of the right people. That March evening started like any other. Jessica had worked late at the office, putting finishing touches on a campaign presentation scheduled for the next morning. She stopped by the grocery store around 7 p.m., picking up ingredients for dinner and her favorite vanilla ice cream. The security footage from Ralph's supermarket would later show her smiling at the cashier, completely unaware that someone had been watching her every move. Jessica arrived home around 7:30 p.m., parking her silver Honda Civic in her assigned spot. What happened next would haunt investigators for more than 2 decades. According to the timeline reconstructed by police, Jessica made it inside her apartment, set down her groceries, and even started preparing dinner. A pot of water was found boiling on the stove and fresh vegetables were laid out on the cutting board. But somewhere between 8 and 9 p.m., evil walked through Jessica's front door. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, would later tell police she heard what sounded like furniture being moved around 8:15 p.m., followed by a brief period of silence, then what she described as a single loud thump. At the time, she assumed Jessica was rearranging her living room. It wasn't until the next morning that Mrs. Chen realized she had heard the sounds of a struggle and possibly Jessica's final moments. When Jessica failed to show up for her important presentation the next morning, her supervisor, Sarah Mitchell, immediately knew something was wrong. Jessica was the type of person who would call if she was going to be even 5 minutes late. She was responsible, reliable, and passionate about her work. Sarah tried calling Jessica's cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. Concerned, Sarah called Jessica's parents, who immediately drove to their daughter's apartment. David Hamilton used the spare key Jessica had given him for emergencies, and what they found inside would be burned into their memories forever. The apartment showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, Jessica's purse was missing, and there were signs of a break-in at the sliding glass door leading to the small patio. But Jessica was nowhere to be found. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her dinner was half prepared, and her cell phone was discovered hidden under the couch cushions, turned off. The Irvine Police Department responded within minutes of David Hamilton's frantic 911 call. The initial responding officers, Detective Ray Morrison and Officer Amanda Rodriguez, immediately recognized this as a potential abduction case. The scene suggested Jessica had been taken against her will, but there were puzzling elements that didn't fit typical kidnapping patterns. For starters, Jessica's credit cards and cash were still in her wallet, which had been left behind on the kitchen counter. Her jewelry, including a valuable diamond necklace from her grandmother, was untouched. If this was a robbery gone wrong, why leave behind easily portable valuables? The sliding door showed signs of forced entry, but the front door was unlocked, suggesting the perpetrator may have had knowledge of Jessica's routine or had been watching the apartment. Detective Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the Irvine PD, had never worked a case quite like this. Irvine's low crime rate meant that violent crimes, especially potential kidnappings, were extremely rare. But as he examined the scene more carefully, a chilling realization began to set in. The patterns of the struggle, the selective nature of what was taken and what was left behind, and the timing of the incident all pointed to something more sinister than a random crime. The search for Jessica Hamilton began immediately. The Irvine Police Department mobilized every available resource, calling in assistance from the Orange County Sheriff's Department and even the FBI. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Jessica's scent, which led from her apartment to the parking lot, then went cold. Helicopters swept the nearby canyons and open spaces. Volunteers from the community joined organized search parties, combing through every inch of the surrounding area. But after 72 hours of intensive searching, there was no trace of Jessica Hamilton. No witnesses, no clear suspect, and no indication of where she might have been taken. The case that had started as a missing person investigation was about to take a much darker turn. On March 19, 2001, 4 days after Jessica disappeared, a jogger running trails in the Santiago Oaks Regional Park, about 12 miles from Jessica's apartment, made a horrific discovery. Partially hidden beneath a pile of brush and leaves was Jessica's body. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable violence. Jessica had been strangled, and evidence suggested she had fought desperately for her life. Her clothing was disheveled, and there were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had tried to fight off her attacker. Most importantly for the investigation, the killer had left behind biological evidence that would one day be his downfall. Detective Morrison, now leading what had become a homicide investigation, knew that this evidence was crucial. In 2001, DNA analysis was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations, but it was becoming increasingly important in solving violent crimes. Samples were carefully collected from Jessica's body and clothing, as well as from under her fingernails where she may have scratched her attacker. The DNA evidence was processed at the Orange County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab, revealing a clear male profile that didn't match anyone in the local database. This unknown male profile became the most important clue in the case, but without a suspect to compare it to, it was essentially useless. The DNA evidence was carefully stored, waiting for the day when technology and circumstances would align to reveal the killer's identity. The murder of Jessica Hamilton sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Irvine. Suddenly, the suburban paradise that residents had taken for granted felt vulnerable and exposed. If someone like Jessica, careful and cautious, could be targeted and killed in her own home, then no one was truly safe. Detective Ray Morrison became consumed with the case. He interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on countless tips, and pursued every possible lead. Jessica's boyfriend, Michael Torres, was thoroughly investigated and cleared through DNA testing. Her coworkers, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances were interviewed multiple times. Security footage from nearby businesses was analyzed frame by frame, looking for any vehicle or person who seemed out of place on the night of March 15. One of the most promising early leads came from Jessica's work colleagues, who remembered her mentioning that she felt like she was being watched in the weeks leading up to her death. She had told her friend and co-worker, Amanda Price, that she had noticed the same person in different locations where she went regularly, the grocery store, the gym, even near her apartment complex. Jessica had described this person as someone who seemed to blend in, someone who wouldn't normally draw attention. This information led investigators to theorize that Jessica's killer had been stalking her, learning her routine and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The fact that the attack occurred at her apartment, during a time when she would normally be alone, suggested premeditation and planning. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was a calculated predatory attack. The investigation expanded to include postal workers, delivery drivers, maintenance personnel, and anyone else who would have legitimate reasons to be in Jessica's neighborhood on a regular basis. The theory was that the killer needed to be someone who could observe Jessica's routine without arousing suspicion, someone who had a reason to be in the area repeatedly. Kenneth Fraser was interviewed during this phase of the investigation, along with dozens of other postal employees and service workers. At the time, he seemed like every other witness, cooperative, concerned, and eager to help. Fraser told Detective Morrison that he remembered Jessica as a friendly young woman who always smiled and said hello when he delivered her mail. He expressed shock and sadness at her death, and his concern seemed genuine. What investigators didn't know was that they were sitting across from Jessica's killer. Fraser passed the interview without raising any red flags, and his name was added to the list of witnesses who had been cleared and eliminated from suspicion. It was a missed opportunity that would haunt the investigation for decades. As months turned into years, the Jessica Hamilton case remained active but grew cold. Detective Morrison retired in 2008, but not before ensuring that all the evidence was properly preserved and cataloged. He had made a promise to Jessica's parents that he would never stop looking for their daughter's killer, and even in retirement, he continued to review the case file regularly, hoping for new developments. The case was passed to Detective Lisa Park, a rising star in the Irvine PD who had made a name for herself solving difficult cases. Park brought fresh eyes to the investigation, re-interviewing witnesses and re-examining evidence with newer forensic techniques. She had the DNA evidence retested multiple times as technology improved, always hoping that enhanced testing might reveal additional clues. In 2015, Detective Park decided to take a new approach to the case. She began working with the Orange County Cold Case Unit, which had been established to specifically focus on unsolved murders using new technologies and investigative techniques. The unit was equipped with advanced DNA analysis capabilities and had access to newer databases that might contain the killer's profile. The DNA evidence from Jessica's case was run through the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, multiple times over the years, but it never matched any profiles in the database. This meant that either the killer had never been arrested for a felony requiring DNA submission, or he had somehow managed to avoid leaving his DNA profile in any law enforcement database. Detective Park also began exploring new investigative techniques, including geographic profiling and behavioral analysis. She worked with FBI profilers to develop a more detailed psychological profile of Jessica's killer. The profile suggested someone who was organized, patient, and possibly had a job that gave him legitimate access to residential neighborhoods. The killer was likely someone who appeared trustworthy and non-threatening, which allowed him to get close to victims without arousing suspicion. This profile led to renewed focus on service workers, including postal employees, utility workers, and delivery drivers. Kenneth Fraser's name appeared again in the investigation files, but there was still nothing to specifically connect him to the crime beyond his role as Jessica's mail carrier. Throughout the 2010s, Jessica's parents, David and Linda Hamilton, became advocates for cold case investigations and DNA evidence preservation. They worked with other families of murder victims to push for legislative changes that would provide more funding for cold case units and DNA testing. Their tireless advocacy helped pass several important bills in California that expanded the use of DNA evidence in criminal investigations. The Hamiltons also worked with media outlets to keep Jessica's case in the public eye. They appeared on numerous true crime shows, gave interviews to newspapers and magazines, and even started a blog dedicated to their daughter's memory and the ongoing search for her killer. They believed that keeping the case visible might eventually lead to the breakthrough they desperately needed. But despite all these efforts, the case remained frustratingly cold. The DNA evidence was the key to solving the case, but without a suspect to compare it to, it remained a locked door. What the investigators needed was a new approach, a new technology that could use DNA evidence in ways that had never been possible before. That breakthrough was coming, but it would take another several years and a revolution in genetic genealogy before Jessica Hamilton's killer would finally be identified. By 2020, The Jessica Hamilton case had been cold for nearly 2 decades. Detective Lisa Park had retired, and the case had been passed to Detective Michael Chen, a tech-savvy investigator who specialized in using new technologies to solve old crimes. Chen had heard about the revolutionary technique called genetic genealogy that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer in 2018, and he wondered if it might be the key to finally solving Jessica's murder. Genetic genealogy was a game-changing approach that combined traditional DNA evidence with publicly available genetic databases used by people researching their family histories. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and GeneMatch had millions of users who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles to trace their ancestry and find relatives. Law enforcement agencies had discovered that they could use these databases to identify suspects by finding relatives of unknown DNA profiles from crime scenes. The process worked by taking the unknown DNA profile from a crime scene and searching for partial matches in the genetic databases. These partial matches would indicate relatives of the unknown person, cousins, siblings, aunts, uncles, or other family members. Investigators could then use traditional genealogy research to build family trees and identify potential suspects who fit the profile of the perpetrator. Detective Chen knew that genetic genealogy required specialized expertise, so he reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in using genetic genealogy for law enforcement. Parabon had successfully solved hundreds of cold cases using this technology, and they agreed to take on the Jessica Hamilton case. The first step was to extract enough high-quality DNA from the evidence collected in 2001 to create a genetic profile suitable for genealogy research. This was more challenging than regular DNA testing because genetic genealogy required analysis of many more genetic markers than typical forensic DNA testing. Fortunately, the evidence from Jessica's case had been carefully preserved, and there was sufficient material to create the necessary profile. In January 2021, Parabon uploaded the unknown killer's genetic profile to GeneMatch, a database specifically designed to help law enforcement and genealogy researchers. Within hours, the system had identified dozens of potential relatives of the unknown killer, ranging from close family members to distant cousins. The genetic genealogist assigned to the case, Sarah Williams, began the painstaking process of building family trees for each of the identified relatives. This work involved traditional genealogy research using birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and other historical documents to trace family connections back several generations. After weeks of research, Dr. Williams had identified several family lines that could potentially include Jessica's killer. The genetic evidence suggested that the perpetrator was likely descended from Scottish and Irish immigrants who had settled in California in the early 1900s. This narrowed the search considerably, but there were still dozens of potential suspects within the identified family trees. The next step was to use investigative techniques to narrow down the list of potential suspects. Detective Chen worked with Dr. Williams to identify male relatives who would have been the right age to commit the crime in 2001, who lived in or had connections to the Orange County area, and who had no solid alibis for the night of Jessica's murder. One name that appeared on multiple family trees was Kenneth Fraser, born in 1965. Fraser would have been 36 years old at the time of Jessica's murder, fitting the age profile developed by investigators. More importantly, Fraser had worked as a postal employee in Irvine since 1998, which meant he would have been Jessica's regular mail carrier. Detective Chen felt a chill when he saw Fraser's name in the files. Fraser had been interviewed as a witness in 2001, but he had never been considered a serious suspect. The detective pulled Fraser's original interview from the case files and read it with new eyes, looking for any red flags that might have been missed 2 decades earlier. In the original interview, Fraser had described Jessica as a nice, friendly girl, who always greeted him politely when he delivered her mail. He claimed to be shocked by her murder and said he couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. Nothing in the interview had raised suspicions at the time, but Detective Chen now wondered if Fraser had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before making any moves, Detective Chen needed to confirm that Kenneth Fraser was indeed Jessica's killer. The only way to do this definitively was to obtain a DNA sample from Fraser and compare it to the evidence from the crime scene. But this required careful planning because if Fraser was the killer, alerting him to the investigation could cause him to flee or destroy evidence. Detective Chen developed a plan to obtain Fraser's DNA covertly through what's known as a trash pull. This legal technique involves collecting discarded items that might contain DNA evidence, such as cigarette butts, drinking cups, or tissues. Since people have no expectation of privacy for items they throw away, law enforcement can legally collect and test these materials without a warrant. In March 2022, exactly 21 years after Jessica's murder, Detective Chen and a team of surveillance officers began monitoring Kenneth Fraser's daily routine. Fraser still worked as a postal employee, though he had been promoted to a supervisory position at the main Irvine post office. He lived in a modest house in Santa Ana with his wife of 25 years, Margaret Fraser, and had 2 adult children who had moved out of the family home. The surveillance team observed Fraser for several days, noting that he had a very routine lifestyle. He left for work at the same time each morning, took lunch at the same restaurant several times a week, and stopped at the same coffee shop every Friday afternoon. It was at this coffee shop that investigators saw their opportunity. On Friday, March 18, 2022, Detective Chen watched as Fraser ordered his usual large coffee and sat at his regular table by the window. When Fraser finished his coffee and left the restaurant, Chen waited a few minutes before approaching the table. Fraser had left behind his empty coffee cup and a napkin, both potentially containing DNA evidence. The items were immediately transported to the Orange County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The results would determine whether Kenneth Fraser was the man who had brutally murdered Jessica Hamilton 21 years earlier, or whether the genetic genealogy investigation had led to another dead end. 3 days later, Detective Chen received the call that would change everything. The DNA from Fraser's coffee cup was a perfect match to the DNA evidence collected from Jessica Hamilton's body in 2001. After more than 2 decades, they had finally identified Jessica's killer. The confirmation that Kenneth Fraser's DNA matched the evidence from Jessica Hamilton's murder scene set in motion a carefully orchestrated plan to arrest the man who had hidden among them for 21 years. Detective Chen knew that Fraser could not be allowed to suspect that he was under investigation, as this might give him an opportunity to flee or harm others. Working with the Orange County District Attorney's Office, Detective Chen obtained an arrest warrant for Kenneth Fraser on charges of first-degree murder. The warrant was sealed to prevent any information from leaking to the media before Fraser could be taken into custody. On the morning of December 15, 2022, a team of Irvine police detectives and Orange County Sheriff's deputies surrounded Fraser's home in Santa Ana. Fraser was getting ready for work when the officers knocked on his door. According to the arrest report, Fraser appeared genuinely surprised when he was informed that he was being arrested for the murder of Jessica Hamilton. The arrest was captured on body camera footage, which would later be played during Fraser's trial. In the video, Fraser can be heard asking, "Jessica Hamilton, I don't understand. I was her mail carrier. Why would you think I killed her?" His apparent confusion seemed genuine, but investigators had learned not to trust appearances when it came to Kenneth Fraser. Fraser's wife, Margaret, was present during the arrest and appeared to be in complete shock. She had been married to Fraser for 25 years and claimed she had no knowledge of his involvement in any violent crimes. The couple's 2 adult children, Kenneth Jr. and Michelle, also expressed disbelief that their father could be capable of murder. The news of Fraser's arrest sent shockwaves through the Irvine community. For more than 2 decades, residents had lived with the knowledge that Jessica Hamilton's killer was still out there, possibly living among them. The revelation that the killer had been the friendly neighborhood mailman was particularly disturbing for those who had known and trusted Fraser. Fraser's coworkers at the Postal Service were equally stunned. His supervisor, Robert Martinez, told reporters that Fraser had been a reliable, well-liked employee who had never shown any signs of violent behavior. "Ken was the kind of guy you could count on," Martinez said. "He was always on time, got along well with everyone." "This doesn't make any sense," But as investigators dug deeper into Fraser's background, a more complex picture began to emerge. While Fraser had no criminal record and had never been arrested for any violent crimes, there were subtle signs that might have indicated problems beneath the surface. Former neighbors recalled that Fraser had always been very interested in the personal lives of the people on his mail route. He would ask detailed questions about their schedules, their families, and their daily routines. At the time, this had seemed like friendly conversation, but in retrospect, some residents wondered if Fraser had been gathering information for more sinister purposes. Detective Chen also discovered that Fraser had taken several unexplained sick days in the weeks following Jessica's murder in 2001. Fraser had claimed he was suffering from stress and anxiety, which his supervisor had attributed to the shock of having a customer murdered on his route. Now, investigators wondered if Fraser's stress had actually been caused by fear of being caught for the crime he had committed. The psychological evaluation conducted after Fraser's arrest revealed a man who was skilled at presenting a normal, trustworthy facade while harboring dark fantasies and urges. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the forensic psychologist who evaluated Fraser, concluded that he fit the profile of an organized predator who was able to maintain a double life for extended periods. Fraser's trial began in October 2023, nearly 2 years after his arrest. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Michael Rodriguez, built their case around the DNA evidence that definitively linked Fraser to Jessica's murder. They argued that Fraser had used his position as Jessica's mail carrier to learn her routine and identify when she would be most vulnerable. The prosecution's theory was that Fraser had been stalking Jessica for weeks or possibly months before the murder. They presented evidence that Fraser had made several unauthorized visits to Jessica's apartment complex on days when he wasn't scheduled to deliver mail to that area. Building security cameras from 2001 had been destroyed long ago, but investigators were able to piece together Fraser's activities through Postal Service records and witness testimony. According to the prosecution, Fraser had entered Jessica's apartment on the evening of March 15, 2001, possibly by following her inside when she returned from grocery shopping or by using some pretext to gain entry. Once inside, he had attempted to sexually assault Jessica, who fought back violently. In the struggle, Fraser had strangled Jessica to death, then transported her body to Santiago Oaks Regional Park, where it was discovered 4 days later. Fraser's defense team, led by public defender Lisa Chang, argued that the DNA evidence had been contaminated or mishandled during the 21 years it had been in storage. They also suggested that Fraser's DNA could have been transferred to Jessica's clothing through innocent contact during his mail delivery duties. However, the prosecution was able to demonstrate that the DNA evidence had been properly preserved, and that the genetic material found on Jessica's body was consistent with direct physical contact during a violent struggle, not casual transfer from everyday interactions. The defense also attempted to present Fraser as a devoted family man who had no history of violence and no motive to harm Jessica. They brought in character witnesses who testified about Fraser's positive reputation in the community and his dedication to his job and family. But the prosecution countered with expert testimony about the psychology of predatory criminals, explaining how many violent offenders are able to maintain normal, appearing lives while committing horrific crimes. They pointed to other cases where trusted community members had been revealed as dangerous criminals, arguing that Fraser's respectable facade was actually evidence of his sophistication and cunning as a predator. The trial lasted 6 weeks and included testimony from more than 50 witnesses. Jessica's parents, David and Linda Hamilton, were present every day, finally getting their chance to see their daughter's killer face justice. In their victim impact statements, they described the 21 years of pain, uncertainty, and hope they had endured while waiting for this moment. On December 8, 2023, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Kenneth Fraser was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, making him eligible for life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Fraser finally broke his silence and addressed the court. In a brief statement, he said, I am sorry for the pain I have caused the Hamilton family and the community. I cannot explain or excuse what I did, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became capable of such a horrible act. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Fraser to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the special circumstances. In her remarks, Judge Williams noted that Fraser had robbed Jessica Hamilton of her future and her family of decades of happiness, and that his betrayal of community trust made his crimes particularly heinous. The case of Kenneth Fraser stands as a powerful reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary and trusted faces in our communities. For 21 years, Fraser lived a normal life, raising his family, working his job, and maintaining the respect of his neighbors and co-workers, all while knowing that he had brutally murdered an innocent young woman. The breakthrough in genetic genealogy that finally solved Jessica Hamilton's murder has given hope to thousands of families whose loved ones' cases remain unsolved. The technology has already been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the country, bringing closure to families who had given up hope of ever learning the truth. For David and Linda Hamilton, Fraser's conviction represents the end of a 22-year journey for justice, but it also marks the beginning of a new mission. They have become advocates for the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations and have worked to establish a foundation that provides funding for DNA testing in cold cases. The Jessica Hamilton case proves that no matter how much time passes, no matter how well a killer thinks they have hidden their crimes, the truth will eventually come to light. Science, determination, and the refusal to give up on victims and their families will always triumph over evil in the end. Kenneth Fraser thought he had committed the perfect crime. He thought he could hide in plain sight, trusted and respected by his community, while keeping his darkest secret buried forever. But DNA doesn't lie, technology never stops advancing, and the dedicated investigators who refuse to let cases go cold will never stop fighting for justice. Jessica Hamilton's voice was silenced on March 15, 2001. But through the power of forensic science and the determination of those who loved her, her case speaks loudly about the importance of never giving up on the pursuit of truth and justice.